Picture this. You're a lady-in-waiting in the opulent Palace of Versailles, and the year is 1774. The corridors echo with whispers of revolution, but your attention is drawn to something far more disturbing. Behind ornate golden doors lies a chamber that defies everything you thought you knew about royal luxury. There, in the center of what should be the most magnificent bedroom in all of France, sits not a bed draped in silk and velvet, but a cage. And inside that cage, night after night, sleeps the most powerful woman in the kingdom, a queen whose paranoia and guilt have transformed her into a prisoner of her own making. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of aristocratic excess or royal eccentricity. This is the story of how absolute power can corrupt the human mind so completely that luxury becomes torture, safety becomes imprisonment, and a palace becomes a madhouse. The woman in that cage wasn't born a monster, but the crown she wore would twist her into something that haunted the dreams of everyone who served her. Before we dive into this forgotten chapter of royal madness, if you enjoy uncovering the dark secrets that history tried to bury, hit that like button and subscribe for more content like this. And please, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these twisted tales together from all corners of the world, connected by our shared fascination with the shadows of the past. The queen I'm talking about isn't who you might expect. This isn't Marie Antoinette, though their stories would become tragically intertwined. No, the woman who chose to sleep in a cage was someone far more dangerous, far more cunning, and infinitely more paranoid. Her name was Catherine de' Medici, but by the time she began her nightly ritual of locking herself away, she had become something else entirely, a living embodiment of fear disguised as power. To understand how a queen could descend into such madness, we need to go back to the beginning, to a time when Catherine was just another Italian noble's daughter with dreams of grandeur. Born in Florence in 1519, she entered the world already marked by tragedy. Her mother died when Catherine was just 6 days old, and her father followed when she was barely a month old. This wasn't just unfortunate timing, it was a preview of the death that would follow Catherine wherever she went. The Medici family took her in, but even they couldn't protect her from the chaos consuming Italy. By the time she was 7, Catherine had lived through 3 different guardians, 2 city sieges, and countless assassination attempts against her family members. Most children would have been broken by such experiences, but Catherine learned different lessons. She learned that survival meant never trusting anyone completely, that power was the only true protection, and that sometimes the greatest threats came from those closest to you. When she arrived in France at age 14 to marry the future Henry II, Catherine brought with her more than just a dowry and political alliance. She brought the accumulated paranoia of a childhood spent dodging daggers and poison, along with something far more dangerous, an Italian education in the arts of manipulation, surveillance, and elimination. The French court had never seen anything like her. The early years of her marriage were a masterclass in calculated patience. While Henry II openly flaunted his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, Catherine smiled, nodded, and quietly began building the network of spies and informants that would eventually span all of Europe. She learned every secret, catalogued every weakness, and filed away every piece of information that might someday prove useful. But most importantly, she learned to sleep with one eye open. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was just extra locks on her chamber doors. Then came the food tasters, not just 1, but 3, each sampling her meals at different intervals to detect various types of poison. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed that she began checking the window latches multiple times each night, testing the strength of the glass, examining the courtyard below for potential assassins. But it was after Henry's death in 1559 that Catherine's paranoia truly blossomed into something magnificent and terrible. Suddenly, She wasn't just the king's foreign wife. She was the Queen Mother, regent for her young son, Francis II, and the most powerful woman in France. With that power came the crushing realization that everyone around her now had a reason to want her dead. The first attempt on her life came just 3 months after Henry's funeral. A disgruntled noble, angry about being passed over for a court position, tried to slip ground glass into her wine. The plot was discovered. The noble was quietly executed, but the damage to Catherine's psyche was permanent. If someone would try to kill her over something so trivial as a court appointment, what wouldn't they do for real power? The second attempt was more sophisticated, a clockwork device hidden in her prayer book, designed to release poison gas when open to a specific page. Catherine's growing network of spies uncovered this plot as well, but not before she had handled the book multiple times. For weeks afterward, she suffered from mysterious illnesses that her physicians couldn't explain. Symptoms that may have been psychosomatic, or may have been the result of exposure to whatever toxin had been intended for her. It was after the third attempt, a conspiracy involving her own food tasters, who had been bribed to administer a slow-acting poison over several weeks, that Catherine made the decision that would define the rest of her reign. If she couldn't trust anyone to keep her safe while she slept, she would have to create her own protection. The cage wasn't built overnight. Catherine commissioned it in secret, working with a master craftsman from Milan who specialized in what he euphemistically called security furniture for paranoid nobility. The design was her own creation, born from months of careful planning and an intimate understanding of every way she might be vulnerable while unconscious. The structure itself was a marvel of engineering disguised as madness. Built from steel reinforced with iron bands, it measured exactly 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, and 7 feet high, large enough to accommodate a bed, a small table, and a chamber pot, but small enough that Catherine could see every corner from any position inside. The bars were spaced precisely 4 inches apart, too narrow for a hand holding a weapon to reach through, but wide enough for air circulation and observation. But the true genius lay in the details that only Catherine fully understood. The lock was a masterpiece of complexity, requiring not 1 but 3 different keys turned in a specific sequence. 1 key Catherine wore around her neck, another she hid in a different location each night, and the third was kept by her most trusted guard. Though even he didn't know the proper sequence, the floor of the cage was raised 6 inches above the chamber floor, with hidden compartments containing emergency supplies, weapons, antidotes to known poisons, even a small cache of gold coins in case she needed to bribe her way to freedom. The bed inside was specially constructed with steel springs that would alert Catherine to any pressure changes that might indicate an intruder. The mattress itself contained hidden pockets where she kept various defensive items, small knives, vials of poison for her own use if capture seemed inevitable, and even a few precious gems that could be used to blind attackers if thrown with sufficient force. When the cage was finally installed in her private chambers, Catherine's ladies-in-waiting were horrified. Here was the Queen Mother of France, one of the most powerful women in the world, preparing to spend her nights locked up like a wild animal. But Catherine saw it differently. To her, the cage wasn't a prison. It was a fortress. Inside those steel bars, she was finally safe from the countless enemies who wanted her dead. The first night Catherine slept in the cage, she later confessed to her personal chaplain, was the first night in years that she truly rested. The constant vigilance that had exhausted her for so long could finally relax. No one could poison her food while she slept because no food entered the cage. No one could stab her in her sleep because no weapon could reach her. No one could strangle her because no hands could grasp her throat through the bars. But what Catherine had gained in physical security, she began to lose in psychological stability. The very act of locking herself away each night was a constant reminder of how dangerous her world had become. Every click of the lock was an acknowledgement that her power, for all its magnificence, couldn't protect her from the fundamental vulnerability of sleep. The ritual became increasingly elaborate as months passed. Catherine would enter the cage at precisely 10 o'clock each evening, after her chambers had been searched by 3 different guards using 3 different methods. She would lock herself in using the complex sequence of keys, then spend the next hour checking and rechecking every bar, every joint, every potential weakness in her steel sanctuary. Her sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and haunted. Palace guards reported hearing the Queen Mother talking in her sleep, conducting conversations with invisible assassins, negotiating with phantom conspirators, and sometimes screaming warnings about dangers that existed only in her dreams. The cage that was supposed to provide peace had become the stage for nightly performances of terror. During the day, Catherine ruled France with an iron fist, making decisions that affected millions of lives, commanding armies, and manipulating the politics of Europe with surgical precision. But as evening approached, courtiers could see the change in her demeanor. The confident queen would gradually transform into something else. A hunted animal, preparing for another night of captivity, disguised as safety. The psychological toll was evident to anyone who spent time around her. Catherine began to exhibit behaviors that palace physicians couldn't explain. She would unconsciously grip the bars of furniture as if testing their strength. She started eating only foods that could be consumed quickly, as if she expected to be interrupted at any moment. Most disturbing of all, she began to speak about herself in the third person during conversations about security, as if the woman who slept in the cage was someone entirely separate from the queen who ruled during the day. The most chilling aspect of Catherine's nightly imprisonment wasn't the cage itself, but what happened to her mind during those long hours of darkness. As weeks turned to months, and months stretched into years, the Queen Mother began to develop what her personal physician described in his secret notes as a peculiar form of madness that presents itself only in the presence of steel bars. During daylight hours, Catherine remained sharp, calculating, and ruthlessly effective. She could negotiate treaties that would reshape the map of Europe, orchestrate the downfall of enemies with surgical precision, and command the absolute loyalty of her subjects through a combination of fear and respect. But the moment those chamber doors closed and the sun disappeared beyond the palace walls, something fundamental shifted in her consciousness. The cage had created its own ecosystem of paranoia. Catherine began to believe that the steel bars themselves were watching her, that enemies had found ways to spy on her even within her fortress of metal. She started hanging thick tapestries around the outside of the cage, creating a cocoon of fabric that blocked any potential observation. But this only made her more claustrophobic, more aware of her own breathing, more conscious of every sound echoing through the chamber. Her ladies-in-waiting, sworn to secrecy about their mistress's sleeping arrangements, began to notice disturbing changes in Catherine's behavior during their evening preparations. The Queen would insist on examining every thread of her nightgown for signs of tampering, convinced that assassins might weave poison into the very fabric she wore to bed. She developed an obsession with counting the bars of her cage, counting her heartbeats, counting the minutes until dawn would release her from her self-imposed prison. Palace servants whispered about the sounds that emerged from the royal chambers after midnight. Not screams or cries for help, but something far more unsettling, the rhythmic tapping of fingers against steel bars, accompanied by Catherine's voice reciting what sounded like mathematical calculations or chemical formulas. Some claimed she was practicing recipes for poison. Others believed she was working out complex political strategies. The truth was far stranger. Catherine was teaching herself to think like her cage. The transformation became complete when Catherine began to see the world outside her bars as the real prison. During the day, surrounded by courtiers and advisors, she felt exposed and vulnerable. Every smile seemed to hide a dagger. Every bow concealed a potential attack. Every gesture of respect masked murderous intent. Only within her cage did she feel truly free to be herself, even if that self was becoming increasingly divorced from reality. Her correspondence from this period, discovered centuries later, hidden behind a false wall in her chambers, reveals the depth of her psychological descent. In letters never sent, Catherine wrote to her deceased husband Henry, describing her nightly conversations with the bars of her cage as if they were old friends. She gave names to individual steel rods, assigning them personalities and backstories that reflected her own fears and desires. The bar nearest her pillow became Henri, after her dead husband. The one at her feet was Diane, named for Henry's mistress, whom Catherine imagined was still trying to poison her from beyond the grave. But perhaps most disturbing were the letters Catherine wrote to herself. Detailed instructions for the woman who would wake up in the morning, as if the Catherine who slept in the cage was a completely different person from the one who ruled France. These notes contained reminders about ongoing political schemes, warnings about specific courtiers who couldn't be trusted, and increasingly paranoid theories about conspiracies that spanned multiple generations. The Queen's paranoia began to manifest in her governance as well. She started making policy decisions based on dreams she had while locked in her cage, interpreting her nightmares as prophetic visions that revealed future threats to her power. A dream about drowning led to new restrictions on river travel for nobles. A nightmare about being buried alive resulted in laws requiring multiple witnesses for any burial within French territory. Her subconscious fears were literally reshaping the legal framework of the kingdom. Catherine's relationship with her children became another casualty of her nocturnal madness. She began to suspect that even her own sons might be plotting against her, influenced by enemies who whispered poison in their ears during the daylight hours when she couldn't protect them. She started having their food tested with the same rigor as her own, assigned personal guards to monitor their activities, and even considered having smaller cages built for them, though she ultimately decided that their youth made them less likely targets for assassination. The irony wasn't lost on those few courtiers who understood the full extent of Catherine's condition. Here was a woman who had spent her entire adult life manipulating others through fear, using the threat of death as a tool of political control, now living in constant terror of the very fate she had inflicted on countless enemies. The cage had become both her protection and her punishment, a physical manifestation of the psychological prison she had built around herself through decades of ruthless ambition. Foreign ambassadors began reporting back to their home countries about the Queen Mother's strange behavior. Diplomatic meetings that had once run with clockwork precision now had to be scheduled around Catherine's increasingly rigid evening routine. Negotiations would be abruptly halted if they ran past 9:30, regardless of their importance, because Catherine needed time to prepare for her nightly incarceration. This predictability became a weakness that her enemies learned to exploit, timing their most dangerous moves for the hours when they knew the Queen Mother would be locked away and unable to respond immediately. The physical toll of sleeping in a steel cage was becoming apparent as well. Catherine developed chronic back problems from the unforgiving metal bed frame, respiratory issues from the poor air circulation within her fabric-covered prison, and a persistent skin condition that her physicians attributed to prolonged contact with iron. But she refused all suggestions to modify her sleeping arrangements, convinced that any change would compromise her security and leave her vulnerable to attack. Perhaps most tragically, Catherine's cage began to change her relationship with sleep itself. What had once been a natural refuge from the stresses of ruling became another battleground where she fought against her own subconscious. She developed severe insomnia, lying awake for hours within her steel sanctuary, listening for sounds that might indicate approaching danger. When exhaustion finally forced her into unconsciousness, her dreams were filled with images of bars and locks, cages within cages, an endless maze of steel that trapped her even in sleep. The servants who had to clean Catherine's chambers each morning reported finding strange markings on the walls around her cage, scratches and gouges that suggested the Queen Mother was using some kind of tool to mark the passage of time, like a prisoner counting days in a dungeon. But when questioned about these marks, Catherine would claim no memory of making them, insisting that they must be the work of intruders who somehow managed to enter her chambers despite the multiple locks and guards. As 1572 approached, bringing with it the events that would become known as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Catherine's nightly imprisonment had evolved into something that went far beyond simple paranoia. The cage had become her command center, the place where she planned her most brutal political maneuvers. She had mirrors installed at strategic angles so she could observe her entire chamber from within the bars, turning her prison into a watchtower from which she could monitor even her most trusted servants. The woman who had once been Catherine de' Medici, Italian noble and French queen, had been consumed by something far more dangerous than the political enemies she so feared. She had become the architect of her own psychological destruction, trapped not by steel bars, but by the impossible logic of absolute power, corrupted by absolute fear. The true horror of Catherine's condition became apparent when she began to mistake her dreams for reality, and reality for dreams. Palace guards reported finding her in the morning, still locked in her cage, having conversations with invisible visitors she claimed had entered her chambers during the night. She would describe in vivid detail the faces of assassins who had allegedly stood just beyond her bars, taunting her with elaborate death plots that existed only in her fractured mind. But these weren't simple hallucinations born of isolation. Catherine's paranoia had evolved into something far more sophisticated, a complete alternate reality where she was simultaneously the hunter and the hunted. During these episodes, she would conduct negotiations with her imaginary tormentors, offering them gold, titles, even pieces of French territory in exchange for her life. Her ladies-in-waiting would find detailed written agreements scattered around her cage, contracts signed in her own hand with names that belonged to people who had been dead for years. The most disturbing aspect of these nocturnal delusions was their increasing accuracy about real political threats. Catherine would wake up with knowledge of actual conspiracies that her network of spies hadn't yet uncovered, as if her paranoid fantasies were somehow tapping into genuine dangers. When these dream revelations proved accurate, it only reinforced her belief that the cage was not just protecting her body, but somehow enhancing her ability to detect threats through supernatural means. Her physicians were baffled. Dr. Ambroise Parra, the most respected medical mind in France, was secretly summoned to examine the Queen Mother. His private notes, discovered centuries later, describe a patient who displayed a form of madness so particular that it appears to grant wisdom even as it destroys reason. He observed Catherine during one of her nighttime episodes, watching through a hidden panel as she conducted what appeared to be a military strategy session with empty air, discussing troop movements and battle tactics with invisible generals. What Paré couldn't have understood was that Catherine's mind had found a way to transform her imprisonment into a different kind of power. The cage had become her thinking chamber, a place where the normal constraints of rational thought were suspended, allowing her subconscious to process information in ways that her waking mind couldn't achieve. She was essentially using madness as a tool of statecraft, channeling her paranoia into a form of political intuition that made her more dangerous than ever. The servants who worked in the palace during this period developed their own forms of psychological damage from exposure to Catherine's condition. They began to exhibit what court physicians called sympathetic paranoia, constantly looking over their shoulders, jumping at shadows, and developing an obsession with locks and keys. Several ladies-in-waiting requested transfers to other noble houses, claiming they could no longer sleep peacefully after witnessing the Queen Mother's nightly ritual of self-imprisonment. Catherine seemed to sense the effect she was having on those around her, and rather than being concerned, she appeared to find it amusing. She began deliberately varying her routine, sometimes entering the cage early, sometimes late, keeping her staff in a constant state of uncertainty about when the evening's madness would begin. This unpredictability served a dual purpose. It prevented potential assassins from timing their attacks, while also ensuring that everyone in the palace remained on edge, too nervous to plot against her effectively. The cage itself began to show signs of wear from Catherine's increasingly violent nighttime activities. The steel bars bore scratches and dents from unknown impacts, and the locking mechanism required constant maintenance due to what the palace blacksmith described as excessive and forceful manipulation. Catherine had apparently been testing the strength of her prison nightly, perhaps trying to ensure it could withstand not just external attacks, but her own attempts to escape during moments of panic. Foreign intelligence reports from this period paint a picture of a French court teetering on the edge of collective madness. Spanish spies described the palace as a place where reason goes to die, while English observers noted that meetings with French officials had become exercises in navigating around carefully unspoken truths about their ruler's mental state. Everyone knew about the cage, but no one dared acknowledge it directly, creating an atmosphere of shared delusion that infected every aspect of diplomatic relations. Catherine's sons, now young men with their own political ambitions, found themselves caught between fear and fascination with their mother's condition. Charles IX, the current king, began showing signs of his own paranoid tendencies, though he expressed them through different rituals: obsessive hand-washing, compulsive checking of door locks, and an insistence that his food be prepared only by cooks who had been in royal service for more than a decade. Henri, the future Henri III, developed what appeared to be the opposite reaction, becoming recklessly bold in his behavior, as if trying to prove he was immune to the fear that consumed his mother. The most tragic figure in this unfolding drama was Catherine's youngest son, François, Duke of Alençon. Still a teenager, he'd grown up watching his mother's nightly transformation from powerful queen to caged animal. The psychological impact was devastating. He began sleepwalking, often found by guards wandering the palace corridors in his nightclothes, searching for something he could never identify when awakened. Palace physicians theorized that he was unconsciously seeking his own cage, a place where he could feel as safe as his mother claimed to feel. Catherine's correspondence during this period reveals the full extent of her delusion. In letters to other European monarchs, she began making references to consultations with my advisors that clearly took place during her caged hours with imaginary counselors. She would cite conversations with long-dead political figures as if they were recent meetings, and make policy recommendations based on strategic insights gained from what she called nocturnal intelligence gathering. These letters were often intercepted by foreign spies who initially dismissed them as coded messages. But intelligence analysts eventually realized they were reading the unfiltered thoughts of a mind that had lost the ability to distinguish between reality and hallucination. This revelation sent shockwaves through European courts, as rulers suddenly understood that the woman who had been manipulating continental politics for decades was essentially insane, and yet somehow still terrifyingly effective. The economic impact of Catherine's condition began to manifest in unexpected ways. The constant modifications to her security arrangements were draining the royal treasury. Beyond the initial cost of the cage, there were ongoing expenses for guards, food tasters, specialized locks, and the small army of craftsmen required to maintain and modify her prison. But more significantly, Catherine's increasingly erratic schedule was disrupting the normal functions of government. Trade negotiations were postponed when Catherine claimed her night advisors had warned against specific commercial arrangements. Military campaigns were delayed because the Queen Mother insisted on consulting with phantom generals who only appeared in her dreams. Tax collections suffered because Catherine would suddenly change fiscal policies based on warnings from imaginary enemies about economic conspiracies. The entire French administrative system was being reorganized around the delusions of a woman who spent her nights talking to steel bars. The palace staff developed elaborate protocols for managing Catherine's condition without acknowledging it directly. Servants learned to speak in euphemisms, referring to the cage as Her Majesty's private chapel and her nighttime delusions as evening prayers. Guards were trained to respond to her calls for help during imaginary attacks by arriving at her chambers, checking the locks, and assuring her that all was secure without ever mentioning that the threats she described were products of her own mind. This conspiracy of silence extended throughout the French court and eventually across Europe. Diplomats, nobles, and even foreign rulers learned to navigate conversations with Catherine while carefully avoiding any reference to her mental state. It became a kind of international etiquette, a shared understanding that acknowledging the Queen Mother's madness would somehow make it more real and more dangerous. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Catherine's descent into cage-bound paranoia was how it began to influence her approach to governance. The woman who had once been content to manipulate politics from the shadows now began implementing policies designed to transform all of France into a reflection of her own psychological state. She proposed new laws requiring nobles to sleep in designated locations that could be monitored by royal guards. She suggested establishing networks of informants in every household, turning the entire kingdom into an extension of her surveillance system. Most disturbing of all, Catherine began advocating for what she called protective custody for anyone she deemed vulnerable to assassination, which increasingly meant anyone who opposed her policies. These weren't traditional imprisonment sentences, but rather mandatory residence in specially constructed chambers that bore an unmistakable resemblance to her own cage. The Queen Mother was essentially trying to lock up all of France in steel bars, convinced that she was protecting her subjects from the same threats that haunted her own dreams. As 1572 progressed toward the summer months that would bring the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Catherine's nightly imprisonment had evolved from a personal coping mechanism into a form of governance. She was ruling France from within a cage of her own construction, making decisions that would affect millions of lives based on conversations with phantoms and strategies developed in dreams. The woman who slept behind steel bars had become more dangerous than any of the enemies she imagined were trying to kill her, because she had learned to weaponize her own madness against an entire kingdom. The stage was set for Catherine to unleash upon France the same paranoid violence that consumed her nights, transforming her personal prison into a template for national terror. The cage that was supposed to protect her had instead created a monster whose greatest threat was not to herself, but to everyone unlucky enough to live under her rule. The psychological mechanisms that Catherine had developed to survive her nightly imprisonment began manifesting in ways that horrified even her most hardened courtiers. By the autumn of 1572, the Queen Mother had started conducting what she called cage councils, formal meetings where she would address her ministers and advisors while locked behind her steel bars, as if the physical barrier somehow enhanced her authority rather than undermining it. These sessions took place in the pre-dawn hours, when Catherine claimed her mind was most receptive to what she termed protective wisdom. Ministers would be summoned at 3 or 4 in the morning, forced to stand in her chambers while she remained seated within her cage, conducting affairs of state like some oracle speaking from behind temple bars. The image was both pathetic and terrifying. The most powerful woman in France had become indistinguishable from a caged animal, yet her political instincts remained as sharp as ever. Foreign ambassadors who witnessed these cage councils reported back to their home countries with descriptions that read like fever dreams. The Venetian envoy wrote to the Doge describing a scene where Catherine, speaking through steel bars in her nightgown, negotiated a trade agreement worth millions of ducats, while occasionally pausing to address invisible advisors standing in empty corners of her chamber. The Spanish ambassador's dispatches to Philip II included detailed sketches of the cage itself, along with observations about how Catherine's imprisonment seemed to have enhanced rather than diminished her political cunning. What made these early morning sessions particularly unsettling was Catherine's habit of incorporating her dream conversations into real policy discussions. She would reference advice given by long-dead French kings, cite military strategies suggested by phantom generals, and make diplomatic decisions based on intelligence gathered from imaginary spies who visited her cage during the night. Her ministers learned to nod seriously at these pronouncements, understanding that challenging the Queen Mother's sources of information could result in accusations of treason. The most disturbing aspect of Catherine's condition was how it began affecting her perception of loyalty and betrayal. Anyone who showed concern for her mental state was immediately suspected of trying to undermine her authority by questioning her methods. Anyone who accepted her behavior without comment was suspected of secretly mocking her behind her back. The cage had created a psychological trap where no response from those around her could be interpreted as genuinely supportive. Dr. Ambroise Paré's secret medical observations from this period reveal the full extent of Catherine's transformation. He noted that she had developed what he called reverse claustrophobia, a pathological fear of open spaces that made her increasingly reluctant to leave her cage even during daylight hours. She began conducting more and more of her daily business from within the steel bars, having meals brought to her there, receiving visitors while imprisoned, and even holding court sessions in her chambers with herself as the caged centerpiece. The physical deterioration was becoming impossible to hide. Catherine's skin had taken on a greyish pallor from lack of sunlight and fresh air. Her hair was falling out in patches, leaving bald spots that she tried to conceal with elaborate wigs and headdresses. Most disturbing of all, her hands had developed a permanent tremor from gripping the steel bars night after night, giving her the appearance of someone suffering from a wasting disease. But it was the change in her eyes that truly frightened those who served her. Where once there had been calculating intelligence mixed with carefully controlled paranoia, now there was something far more dangerous. The look of someone who had moved beyond fear into a realm of pure predatory instinct. Catherine was no longer afraid of her enemies. She had become something that should be feared by everyone else. The servants responsible for maintaining Catherine's chambers began reporting increasingly strange discoveries. Hidden throughout the room were small caches of weapons, knives tucked behind tapestries, vials of poison concealed in furniture joints, even a loaded crossbow disguised as a decorative wall hanging. It became clear that Catherine had transformed her entire living space into an arsenal, preparing for a siege that existed only in her imagination, but which she was determined to survive. More disturbing were the written materials found scattered around her cage. Catherine had begun composing what appeared to be military dispatches, detailed battle plans for conflicts that weren't happening, and elaborate charts tracking the movements of enemy armies that didn't exist. These documents were written in her own hand but addressed to commanders who had been dead for years, creating a paper trail of madness that documented her complete break with reality. The palace guards assigned to protect Catherine's chambers developed their own psychological problems, from prolonged exposure to her condition. Several requested transfers to other duties, claiming they could no longer distinguish between the Queen Mother's imaginary threats and potential real dangers. Others began exhibiting paranoid behaviors themselves, constantly checking locks and looking over their shoulders, as if Catherine's madness was somehow contagious. The economic impact of maintaining Catherine's delusions was becoming staggering. The royal treasury was being drained not just by the physical costs of her security arrangements, but by the inefficiencies created by her erratic decision-making. Trade agreements were cancelled based on dream warnings, military campaigns were redirected to address phantom threats, and entire government departments were reorganized to accommodate intelligence that existed only in Catherine's fractured mind. Catherine's relationship with her own reflection became another source of concern for those who observed her closely. She had mirrors installed at various angles around her cage, ostensibly for security purposes. But servants noticed that she would often spend hours staring at her own image, conducting conversations with what appeared to be a different version of herself. These mirror dialogues were overheard by guards, who reported that Catherine seemed to be negotiating with her reflection, trying to convince this other version of herself to reveal information about assassination plots. The Queen Mother's correspondence during this period shows clear evidence of her deteriorating grip on reality. Letters to foreign rulers would begin with normal diplomatic language, but gradually descend into rambling descriptions of nocturnal visitors and references to conversations with historical figures. Some letters were written entirely in cipher, but when decoded by intelligence services, they revealed not state secrets, but detailed accounts of Catherine's dreams, as if she believed her nighttime hallucinations contained information vital to international security. Perhaps most tragically, Catherine's condition began affecting her relationship with her own memories. She started confusing events from her dreams with actual historical occurrences, rewriting her own past to incorporate the paranoid fantasies that now dominated her thoughts. She would speak confidently about assassination attempts that had never happened, describe in vivid detail conspiracies that existed only in her imagination, and reference conversations with people who had never set foot in France. The palace physicians were completely out of their depth. Medieval medicine had no framework for understanding the kind of psychological breakdown Catherine was experiencing. They prescribed various treatments: bloodletting to balance her humours, herbal remedies to calm her nerves, even religious ceremonies to exorcise what some believed were demonic influences. Nothing worked, and several doctors privately expressed their belief that the Queen Mother was beyond any form of medical intervention. Catherine's sons watched their mother's descent into madness with a mixture of horror and calculating political interest. Charles IX, still officially the king but increasingly dominated by his mother's influence, began showing signs of inheriting her paranoid tendencies. He started requesting food tasters for his own meals and expressing concerns about assassination plots that seemed to mirror his mother's delusions. Henri, always the most politically astute of Catherine's children, began quietly building his own power base, recognizing that his mother's condition might soon make her a liability rather than an asset. The international implications of Catherine's madness were becoming impossible to ignore. European rulers who had once feared her political acumen now found themselves dealing with a woman whose decisions were based on conversations with phantoms. Diplomatic negotiations became exercises in navigating around Catherine's delusions, while still maintaining the pretense that she was a rational actor in international affairs. The most chilling development was Catherine's growing obsession with what she called protective elimination. She began advocating for the systematic removal of anyone she perceived as a threat. But her definition of threat had expanded to include virtually anyone who showed the slightest sign of independence or criticism. She started compiling lists of names: nobles who had questioned her policies, servants who had looked at her strangely, even random citizens who had been reported for making jokes about the royal family. These lists were not idle fantasies. Catherine had the resources and authority to act on her paranoid impulses, and she began using her network of spies and assassins to investigate the people whose names appeared on her nocturnal hit lists. Several minor nobles disappeared during this period, their deaths officially attributed to accidents or natural causes, but rumours circulated that they had been eliminated because they appeared in the Queen Mother's dreams as potential threats. The transformation of Catherine's paranoia from a personal affliction into a tool of statecraft reached its peak in the spring of 1572. She began proposing what she called national security reforms that would essentially transform France into a mirror of her own psychological state. Every citizen would be required to report on their neighbours' activities. Every household would be subject to surprise searches for weapons or seditious materials, and anyone suspected of disloyalty would be placed in protective custody in facilities that bore an unmistakable resemblance to her own cage. The French nobility, already nervous about Catherine's erratic behaviour, began to realise that their Queen Mother's madness posed an existential threat to their way of life. Secret meetings were held to discuss how to manage a ruler who was simultaneously insane and incredibly dangerous. Some advocated for open rebellion. Others suggested seeking intervention from foreign powers. But most concluded that the safest course was to play along with Catherine's delusions while quietly preparing for the inevitable catastrophe. Catherine seemed to sense the growing opposition to her rule, but rather than moderating her behaviour, she doubled down on her paranoid preparations. She ordered the construction of additional cages throughout the palace, claiming they were needed to protect other members of the royal family from assassination attempts. She increased the number of her personal guards, expanded her network of food tasters, and began carrying weapons openly during her rare appearances outside her chambers. The palace itself was being transformed into a reflection of Catherine's mental state. Corridors were fitted with additional locks and guards, rooms were searched multiple times daily for hidden weapons or poisons, and servants were required to follow elaborate protocols designed to prevent any possibility of treachery. The seat of French power had become a fortress built not to keep enemies out, but to contain the madness within. As summer approached, bringing with it the wedding celebrations that would provide the pretext for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Catherine's nightly imprisonment had evolved into something far more dangerous than personal paranoia. She was now using her cage as a command center for planning what she saw as a preemptive strike against all the enemies who threatened her in her dreams. The woman who slept behind steel bars was preparing to unleash upon France a level of violence that would make her personal madness seem insignificant by comparison. The most terrifying aspect of Catherine's condition was how it had enhanced rather than diminished her political effectiveness. Her paranoid delusions had given her a kind of cruel clarity about the nature of power and the necessity of eliminating threats before they could materialize. She had learned to channel her madness into a form of ruthless pragmatism that made her more dangerous than any sane ruler could ever be. The cage that was supposed to protect Catherine from her enemies had instead created a monster whose greatest threat was not to herself, but to everyone unlucky enough to live under her rule. The woman who had started as a frightened Italian noble trying to survive in a hostile French court had become something far worse, a paranoid tyrant whose personal demons were about to be unleashed upon an entire kingdom. The psychological preparation for what Catherine would later call her grand cleansing began during those haunting pre-dawn hours in her cage during the summer of 1572. As she sat behind her steel bars, surrounded by the phantoms of her imagination, she developed what she believed was the perfect solution to her security problems. If she couldn't trust anyone, then she would simply eliminate everyone who posed even the slightest potential threat. The planning sessions took on an almost ritualistic quality. Catherine would unlock her cage at precisely 4 a.m, spread maps and lists across her floor, and begin what she called strategic consultations with her invisible advisors. To anyone observing from outside, it appeared she was conducting military briefings with empty air, but in Catherine's fractured mind, she was receiving counsel from the greatest military minds in French history. Her target lists grew exponentially during these nocturnal strategy sessions. What had started as a handful of names, political rivals and suspected conspirators, expanded into categories that encompassed thousands of potential victims. Protestant nobles who might challenge Catholic authority, merchants whose wealth could fund rebellions, scholars whose ideas might inspire dissent, even servants who had worked in the palace long enough to know too many secrets. Catherine's method for selecting victims revealed the twisted logic of her paranoid mind. She would throw dice while reciting names, interpreting the numbers as divine guidance about who posed the greatest threat. She consulted astrological charts, looking for cosmic signs that certain individuals were destined to betray her. Most disturbing of all, she began having prophetic dreams where the ghosts of her enemies' future victims would visit her cage, thanking her in advance for preventing their deaths by eliminating their would-be killers. The approaching wedding of her daughter Marguerite to Henri of Navarre provided the perfect cover for Catherine's planned massacre. Protestant nobles from across France would gather in Paris for the celebrations, concentrating her enemies in a single location where they could be eliminated efficiently. In her cage-bound planning sessions, Catherine began referring to the wedding as the gathering of the harvest, viewing the festivities as an opportunity to reap the threats she had been cultivating in her paranoid imagination. Dr. Ambroise Paré's final observations of Catherine before the massacre paint a portrait of a woman who had moved beyond madness into something approaching supernatural malevolence. He noted that she had developed what he called predatory stillness. the ability to remain motionless for hours while her eyes tracked invisible targets moving around her chamber. Her breathing had become so shallow that servants sometimes checked to ensure she was still alive, only to have her suddenly speak without warning, addressing phantom conspirators with threats of immediate execution. The physical preparations for the massacre were conducted with the same meticulous attention to detail that Catherine applied to her nightly security rituals. She personally inspected weapons, tested poison formulations, and reviewed architectural plans of noble houses to identify the most efficient entry points for her assassins. But unlike a conventional military campaign, these preparations were filtered through the lens of her paranoid delusions, resulting in plans that were simultaneously brilliant and completely divorced from reality. Catherine's assassins, men who had served her faithfully for years without fully understanding the extent of her madness, found themselves receiving increasingly bizarre instructions. They were told to eliminate not just specific individuals, but entire bloodlines based on Catherine's belief that treachery was hereditary. They were given detailed descriptions of conspirators who existed only in her dreams, complete with physical characteristics and behavioral patterns that would help identify these phantom enemies. The most chilling aspect of Catherine's pre-massacre planning was how she incorporated her cage-bound rituals into the operational details. She insisted that all killings must take place during specific hours when her night advisors would be available to guide the assassin's hands. She demanded that certain victims be eliminated in ways that mirrored the death scenarios from her nightmares, as if reality needed to conform to the prophetic visions generated by her fractured psyche. As August 1572 approached, Catherine's behavior reached new heights of disturbing intensity. She began conducting what she called rehearsal sessions in her cage, acting out the massacre in elaborate pantomimes where she played all the roles, victim, assassin, and commanding officer simultaneously. Palace guards reported hearing her voice change dramatically during these performances, sometimes speaking in different accents as she portrayed various characters in her homicidal fantasy. The psychological toll on everyone around Catherine was becoming unbearable. Her ladies-in-waiting developed nervous conditions that left them jumping at shadows and speaking in whispers even when she wasn't present. Palace servants began requesting transfers to other noble houses, claiming they could no longer sleep peacefully, knowing what horrors were being planned in the chambers above their quarters. Even her most hardened guards, men who had witnessed battlefield carnage without flinching, found themselves disturbed by the casual way Catherine discussed mass murder as if she were planning a garden party. Catherine's sons watched their mother's final descent into homicidal madness with growing alarm. Charles IX, still technically king but completely dominated by his mother's will, found himself being drawn into her paranoid worldview, despite his attempts to maintain some semblance of sanity. Henri recognized that his mother had become a liability that threatened not just their dynasty, but the stability of France itself. Yet he lacked the power to challenge her directly. The international community began receiving disturbing intelligence reports about the French court's preparations for something unprecedented. Spanish spies reported massive purchases of weapons and poison, while English agents noted the suspicious movement of troops toward Paris. But none of these foreign observers could have imagined that the coming massacre was being orchestrated by a woman who spent her nights locked in a steel cage, taking orders from hallucinations and planning genocide based on the advice of imaginary counselors. On the night of August 23, 1572, Catherine performed her final ritual in the cage that had been both her salvation and her damnation. She unlocked the steel bars one last time, emerging not as the frightened Italian noble who had first sought refuge behind those barriers, but as something far more dangerous, a paranoid tyrant whose personal demons were about to be unleashed upon thousands of innocent victims. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre that followed would claim the lives of over 10,000 Protestants across France, making it one of the bloodiest religious persecutions in European history. But those who understood the true origins of the violence knew it wasn't really about religion at all. It was the inevitable result of a woman's descent into madness, a paranoid fantasy made horrifically real through the corrupting influence of absolute power. Catherine de' Medici died in 1589, 17 years after the massacre she had orchestrated from within her cage. Her final years were spent in increasing isolation, as even her most loyal supporters could no longer stomach the sight of their queen conducting affairs of state from behind steel bars. The cage that had once provided her with a sense of security had become her tomb, a prison that contained not just her body, but the remnants of whatever humanity she had once possessed. The steel structure itself was secretly dismantled after Catherine's death, its existence too embarrassing for the French court to acknowledge. But the psychological legacy of the Queen Mother's madness lived on, serving as a warning about the dangers of allowing fear to transform into power, and power to transform into something that destroys everything it touches. Catherine de' Medici had sought safety in a cage of her own making, only to discover that the greatest threat to her kingdom had been sleeping inside those bars all along.